In the words of poet Michael Harriot, they're right. I don't know what's in that vaccine. I also don't know what's in hydroxychloroquine, or Robitussin, or tea, or anointing oil, or the blood of Jesus. Shit, I don't know what's in people's thoughts and prayers. Also, I eat hot dogs. The poet Michael Harriot tells a very familiar story that many Americans are hearing right now. And that is, I don't know what's in the vaccine, so I just won't take it. But on Monday, August 23rd, the FDA approved Pfizer's booster shot vaccine, which opens us up to the greatest question of all time. What's going on with this vaccine, and should we be trusting the vaccine process? Tonight, we're going to explore Pfizer's COVID vaccine being approved by the FDA. And from One Clap Podcast, this is the half hour. My name is Spencer Travis.
And I'm YuYu Yuan.
And welcome. So, first and foremost, last week we did have a conversation stating, whoa, we shouldn't be telling jokes about topics that are like really sensitive, that people can be like, whoa, I might have had a loved one that died from COVID-19. Okay. This is maybe a different story. Okay. COVID-19 is, yes, you have to be very careful with it. But the reason why I like this specific quote from Michael Harriot is because it tells the truth. It tells the truth about what's going on with American society. And that takes a very different perspective. We were talking actually prior to the podcast starting, YuYu, and it was the site we were like talking about, hey, maybe we should be reading the room, right? And reading the room is a really good idea, especially before making a quote like this. This is an excellent introduction to any Extemp speech. And I think you'd have my attention right away. You'd have anybody's attention just in normal conversation.
Yeah. One other thing, though, is I think I would avoid saying the S word because judges don't like that for some reason. Some judges are okay with that, but most likely they're not okay with that. So you should definitely read the room. But I do think it's a fun way to start a Extemp speech and hook in your audience.
Absolutely. And I'll try my best to keep it minimal. We'll try to keep it PG around here, PG-13 at best. But you gotta use it when it's something that's really funny.
Yeah. So with that being said, while we can make fun of the situation that is going on with the COVID-19 vaccine, we should make a note here about the problems that relate to COVID-19 misinformation and make sure that people are reading through the CDC's website. This is a podcast on several different issues and will do its best to avoid any form of misinformation. However, it's always good to double check the CDC for the latest guidance regarding the COVID-19 pandemic and getting vaccinated. Also, another disclaimer here, while we are talking about a heavily politicized issue, it is in no way, shape, or form our intention to cause harm or offense. We just want to inform our listeners on the best way to approach a subject, especially in extemporaneous speaking.
And that's a pretty important disclaimer, all things considered. Like, this is a very sensitive topic. COVID-19 has definitely seen a very politicized issue that's happening right now. And for some reason, the moment that the topic just hits, it's like, oh, I'm not going to listen to this, or I'm not going to listen to that. Like, my stance is my stance. I believe what I believe. It's a very difficult topic to just talk about in general. And for a lot of reasons, that kind of, it scares people because they don't want to hear other people's opinions. This is a really good, important thing to note. All we're trying to do is provide both sides to the topic. We understand that there are articles out there that state this is a conspiracy theory, that this is not actually true, or here's what the real facts are. we want to be able to provide both sides with an answer that we think is reasonable. Is that a good way to put that, YuYu?
I think that's a pretty good way to put it. And I think both of us want to encourage our listeners and anybody else that's listening to keep your mind open on various subjects. And sometimes there will be right answers, sometimes there are wrong answers, and sometimes there are multiple answers. So you need to be aware of that. But hopefully, this podcast can help you make informed decisions in your life generally and great Extemp speeches.
With that being said, let's go ahead and dive into some background information. Now, I'm going to provide a very unique background that not a lot of people have heard a lot about. And this is going to be excellent for talking about COVID-19 because there has been a very long history of pandemics. But the one that is the most important that listeners and people should really be advised about is the Spanish flu pandemic. Let me start by asking just a general question. When was the last time you were actually taught about the Spanish flu? The answer to that probably is never, because biology class just skips over it, history class skips over it. As a matter of fact, written in the book Flu by Gina Kolata, who is somebody who studies diseases and pandemics, back in 1999, stated that college didn't even talk about it. They talk about things like the Black Plague or other instances of major viruses. Shoot, even the biggest topic that was relevant prior to COVID-19 was the Ebola epidemic. We don't talk about the Spanish flu, but the Spanish flu is the most similar pandemic to COVID-19, which makes it the most interesting topic. So let's break down the Spanish flu and let's actually compare it to what's going on. In 1918, we noticed that the Spanish flu pandemic, after everything was done, had an estimated death toll of 675,000 people in the United States. And there were estimates that between 20 million and 50 million people that died worldwide. The pandemic affected most adults aged 20 to 40. That sounds pretty similar. We've got numbers that are almost comparable to that death toll right now from COVID-19 in the US. But here's where it gets interesting. When the pandemic happened, governors of states issued mask mandates that were quite different from the ones that we were seeing in the 2020 pandemic. Rather than the general advice of the mask just having to cover the mouth and the nose, it also had to be a certain kind of thickness to ensure that people were not spreading it person to person. Now, on top of that, it also had to be a certain type of cloth. So what makes these mask mandates now and why people are protesting them now, in all honesty, kind of confuses me, considering the fact that they were a lot more strict 100 years ago. But also in 1918, people protested those mask mandates, even though the Spanish flu infected nearly a third of the world's population. So the trends are very similar. There are a lot of parallels between the Spanish flu and COVID-19. So that's the biggest reason why it's so important. The COVID-19 pandemic and the Spanish flu have a lot of the same parallels. History shows similar problems that were implemented during the Spanish flu that also appeared during our current pandemic. So we're going to look at two parts to that. First, maybe it isn't a coincidence that people are not willing to wear their mask in public. If the same thing happened 100 years ago, it was going to happen anyway. So this is a sign that polarization really didn't have a lot to do with people's choice based on the pandemic. But let me make a side note there. It is possible that former President Trump could have escalated the wearing the mask in public debate. But for the listener's point of view, I'm going to let them leave that up to for you to decide. It's not my choice. It's not my place to turn around and say that former President Trump is what created that polarization on that. But it can be up to the listeners to decide that. But here's the second point. If there's a lot of these parallels that exist between the Spanish flu and COVID-19, and there are, then that vaccine hesitancy that's happening now, it would have also happened during the Spanish flu. Now, we're going to talk about how the Spanish flu really didn't have a vaccine that was developed for it. Okay? But that vaccine hesitancy would have also happened. It's so easy to see it. Everything lines up in the same pattern. The fact that it happened, this pandemic that happened 100 years ago, had created this big divide in the country, is also happening now. And that vaccine hesitancy would have also existed in 1918. So that draws us to the science and technology part. Obviously, it's a really good thing to know how technology is advanced, but let's talk about how they developed a vaccine or failed to develop a vaccine for the Spanish flu. Because at the time of the Spanish flu, some vaccines were made to prevent the flu from spreading. But at the given time, scientists were still puzzled about what the flu exactly was. In October of 1918, William H. Park was working on Pfizer's, that's not Pfizer's, it's Pfizer's influenza vaccine. This vaccine was specified to target the flu as a bacterium, not as a virus. So to keep a long story short, the health commissioner of New York City at the time, who was Royal S. Copeland, stated that they were not so confident that the vaccine would actually work as it showed no signs of being successful against the flu virus. That's very different from today, where we have that technology to where Pfizer is having an approval to use the vaccine. With the flu back in 1918, that wasn't the case. Obviously, technology has advanced so much since then. I will note there's a much more fascinating history involving the vaccines of the Spanish flu from the CDC. We will link that source in the description of this podcast, or you can find it on the OneClap website. It's really intriguing. There's a lot of really cool history to it, and I absolutely recommend reading it through. Very good comparison material for COVID-19. But later down the road, scientists were intrigued by the changing outcomes of the flu virus. Later, we saw the bird flu, and of course, the most recent was the 2009 H1N1. All of these were just as important in the long haul because many of them derived from a shift strain in the H1N1 virus. And actually, that H1N1 was the 1918 virus. So that virus has developed over time. It has mutated. That does beg a question. What is that flu shot? When they ask you to go and get the flu shot, well, that flu shot that you get every year, the CDC explains it as a seasonal vaccine that contains what research shows to be the 4 most prominent strains of the flu in the upcoming season. But that doesn't mean that it actually targets what could be the most prominent strain. Okay? This is just based off of their research. Okay? And sometimes that research isn't always correct. Okay? Now, the studies are oftentimes well done, but obviously there can be those situations in which we could end up with another flu pandemic. So why is this the case? Well, the truth is, through the development of the vaccine against the flu, it has been extremely difficult to recreate the virus that was as deadly as the one in 1918. As a matter of fact, nobody has done that. The 1918 viral strain has never been recreated, and they can't find a way to recreate the deadly infectious virus that killed 675,000 people in this country. So the thing is it's changed so much that we don't have a vaccine against the origin of the virus. That is where COVID-19 is extremely different. The vaccine that we have that prevents COVID-19, or the research shows prevents COVID-19, is a vaccine that is going against the origin of the COVID-19 virus. We don't have that vaccine for the flu. It doesn't exist. So to keep a brief history of Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine, in December of 2020, the FDA approved two vaccines. It was the Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna. Trials from the vaccine showed 95% efficacy rates on the vaccines. The vaccines are both developed with what is called mRNA, which is a decoder that takes apart the original strain of RNA that is held by the COVID-19 virus. Simply put, the vaccines are safe and effective after going through trials. That didn't happen with the Spanish flu. That is technological innovation, and the development of science that we can see has progressed over time. And recently, on Monday, August 23rd, the FDA announced Pfizer's approval for the vaccine booster shot after 8 months of having the vaccine. And YuYu, I think that this is a really good comparison. There are so many different parallels to how COVID-19 and the Spanish flu have happened over time, considering the protesting of the mask mandates, the work to try to develop a vaccine. But we can see that as technology and science has developed over time, that we have been able to make successful progress against going against big pandemics such as this one.
Yeah, and I 100% agree with that. You can see the similarities of what's happened with the Spanish flu and COVID-19, but it's also important to take note of the technological differences. Like back then, it took forever to develop a vaccine because our method of trying to develop a vaccine was different. We had to get a dead strain of the virus, and if we didn't have that virus, we had to try to recreate it. But now we have better technology. Instead, we can use mRNA, which does a better and effective job of creating strains of a virus that helps us create antibodies in our own system and boosts our immune system so that we don't die from a deadly virus or that we don't contract a deadly virus as easily, I would say.
Yeah, and it's really interesting just kind of looking at the technological point of view, right? And most people who are judging a speech or listening to somebody talk about COVID-19 won't realize a lot of those parallels. They're not going to realize like the similarities that have happened with the spreading of the virus and the differences between how the vaccine has basically been developed compared to a previous pandemic. And I think that makes for a very good starter for a discussion pertaining to COVID-19, rather than just jumping right into the topic and saying, well, this is what I believe.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I also think it's just interesting to note the differences between now and back then, because like, as we all know from the Black Plague, those medical masks used to be the creepy bird things with like gigantic beaks. And now we've evolved from that to just having like a 3-layer fabric that blocks any like particles as best as it can from traveling and from spreading. And it's, I think, way more convenient than wearing a gigantic mask with a beak. So I don't know, that's a potential hook for you in your next COVID-19 speech about masks or something. But another thing I do want to touch on a little bit more while we have this discussion started is the fear that people have about getting vaccines and why people are so stubborn about, getting vaccinated in general. So before talking about possible questions and ways to approach them, we have to discuss why things got so polarized and there's still people who refuse to get vaccinated. I mean, there are obvious reasons why people don't want to be vaccinated, and some of them are very legitimate. For example, some people have allergies to ingredients used in vaccines, or some people have an autoimmune disease where they can't have the slightest amount of a virus in them, or it could potentially cause them a lot of harm and they would die. And some of them don't want to get vaccinated because of religious reasons, which can be valid too. But some of them are not so legitimate. For example, people still believe vaccines can cause autism. And the one that's currently trending right now is the COVID-19 vaccines being used to microchip and surveillance you. Yeah, that's not true. Please go to the CDC website. That is not true. I don't think the government really wants to microchip people and surveil every single person in the United States, nor do I think we have the resources or time to do so. But while it may sound like a silly reason to some of us, it is a legitimate reason to others. And that is something important to note because it helps us understand why they don't want to get vaccinated or their fears about getting vaccinated. For some of us, the subject of vaccine misinformation is very new, but vaccine misinformation has been going on for ages. Part of the reason why there's so much fear and controversy around the COVID-19 vaccine is because of misinformation and conspiracy theories. Now, of course, politicization of the vaccine and the polarized world we are in today doesn't really help matters. For example, a New York Times article reported that people in Missouri are obtaining the vaccine in secret because they're scared of backlash from their peers. Or recently, Indiana University students, where I'm at right now, they sued Indiana University for trying to say that vaccines are mandated for coming back to campus. So there's a lot of backlash that colleges are getting and just general people are getting because they're thinking about getting vaccinated or they want vaccines to be required. But at the root of it all, people are just scared and skeptical. So it's important to note that the COVID vaccine isn't the only one that's faced backlash. The MMR, or measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, was allegedly linked to the development of autism. The only proof we had was a paper written by Dr. Walker. And despite the fact that that paper has been rescinded, Dr. Walker lost his medical license, and the only line in the study connecting autism to the MMR vaccine was just that the parents noticed some symptoms of autism after their child got inoculated with no science to back up their claims. People still to this day believe that vaccines can cause autism. Or, like the example brought up by Spencer, if there was a vaccine developed during the Spanish flu, people would still be hesitant about getting the vaccine. Research done by Brendan Nyhan and his team found that despite various attempts at convincing parents against vaccines to vaccinate their children or correcting misinformation, nothing could convince these parents that vaccines were safe. And it makes sense why this was the reaction. We are human beings after all, and when we associate something with danger that could hurt people themselves or people around you, we are heavily against it. The problem that we have been faced with for decades is how to convince people that it's okay to get vaccinated because it's safer for everyone. And whether we like it or not, politics has had a huge role to play in the COVID-19 vaccine controversy. Republicans think the news surrounding COVID is overblown and being used as a tool to make former President Trump look bad. Or even Kamala Harris saying that she won't take the vaccine if Donald Trump says to take the vaccine. But a more pressing matter is that because it's been heavily politicized, people are starting to mistrust science, or they already do. And what I'm mainly getting at is that it's interesting to consider the minority groups are also scared of getting the vaccine or a vaccine in general. And when asked, minority groups had the lowest percentage of people who were willing to take the vaccine. And while science and research has an ethics code, it wasn't always followed in the past. Especially with the extent of racial prejudice back then, many scientists were allowed to take advantage of minority groups and break that ethical code. Take, for example, the Tuskegee study. The purpose of this study was to monitor the progress of syphilis, anemia, and fatigue in Black men. It started in 1932 and lasted until 1972, which really wasn't that long ago. The study included 600 Black men. The men believed that the study was being done to test a new drug that would cure their ailments. And in exchange, they would receive free healthcare, free meals, and burial insurance. Sounds too good to be true, right? And it's kind of very suspicious that they included burial insurance in the agreement too. And yeah, instead of a drug that could cure them, they were given placebos that didn't do anything for their health. And it only gets worse from here. Since penicillin was already approved and proven as a way to help with ailments such as syphilis or anemia back then, these men were still given a placebo because the study wasn't done to help them. The study was done to see how bad their symptoms could get. Eventually, this was reviewed by board members and concluded that it was an unethical study and that these men, or at least the ones that survived, were to be compensated with the Tuskegee Health Benefits Program. But this only happened 30 years after the study had started, meaning the damage was already done. This compensation was also given to their families. So while the last patient died in 2009, there are still 10 people, which were the children of the patients, who still receive medical benefits today. This and other incidents cause minority groups to fear what the government has in plan for them in the future and fear science. In their minds, if they could get away with conducting such a horrible study, then there's probably other things that they can get away with too. Hence why they're hesitant about the vaccine now, and while we still need to work towards convincing many people to get vaccinated. And understanding this fear can only help us answer the Extemp questions that you might get.
Now, this one is really interesting because I have seen a lot of liberal articles take a very odd approach to this question. The question is, could vaccine mandates exacerbate America's worker shortage? That sounds like a question that a lot of the news that you would read would probably be no, because, and just simply put, because workers would feel more safe. I think that's the pretty easy no argument. But if you were to type that question verbatim into Google, you're going to get the New York Times, CNN, Los Angeles Times all saying yes.
Even the Wall Street Journal too.
Yeah, this is one of those really weird questions. And the answer for yes is because companies are struggling just to find hourly workers. So what that means is this. This is an economic problem, okay? Right now, we're seeing retail companies struggling to keep hourly workers. People are quitting at an alarming rate. If you've been following the news, they have recently been doing a lot of reports on how much retail has been falling in the months that are given. For the month of June, for example, for the month of July, it went down 1.1%. And that's actually pretty big when we talk about economics. And that is a lot of the part of the explanation. They are having trouble finding hourly workers. Companies that are competing for, these companies are trying to compete for hourly workers right now. A Kroger store is trying to outbeat Walmart in trying to just find somebody who will work for X amount of time or be able to even work part-time. It's really hard to find these people. And adding a vaccine mandate to that job description could turn away a lot of people to finding that job in a retail store, which makes it continuously more difficult to find workers that will fill those positions. Okay. There was a really good NBC News article that I have linked that has an argument that if you were to require that vaccine mandate as well, you have to pay the hourly employee that time to get that vaccine. If it's somebody who's salaried, they don't have to worry about that. But somebody who's hourly, they might actually have to be paid to get the vaccine on that clock or on the clock. So if they were required to get the vaccine, then the company has to pay for it, which doesn't sound like a lot because it's about half an hour to maybe get the vaccine. But if there's a long line, that could come at the cost of the company. And it's a really, really big hurdle to retail businesses because the goal is to use as much labor as you can for the most amount of time so you can be able to make the biggest buck. So in terms of America's worker shortage, which is specific to retail right now, this is a pretty hard question to answer no to. A lot of really good articles are stating that right now we're having trouble finding the workers, and the fact that we add a vaccine mandate to that just makes it a load more difficult. And there's not a good way to turn around and say, no, these companies, no, people are going to feel safe. Well, if they're struggling finding hourly workers, adding another hurdle is going to make it more difficult.
Yeah, and you can see evidence of this just happening in the news. I follow like Washington Post, CNN on Instagram, and I know they posted something that said flyers looking for nurses at a hospital. They're like, they're advertising that you don't have to get vaccinated, and that's a bonus if you join their company. And I know it faced a lot of backlash because people were like, this is kind of dumb and it's insulting my profession as like a medical worker, because we want people to stay safe. And if you're a medical worker that's not being vaccinated, then it's kind of like not being safe, you know? And so while it might be hard to answer no, because all of the evidence is pointing to yes, it is possible to answer no, but you might be able to do it in a, I don't know, I guess a more convoluted way where you can say, no, the worker shortage is already at its worst, or no, the worker shortage doesn't really have any correlation with like COVID-19 vaccines. It's just going to get worse as a trend. Or you can say something along the lines of like, maybe it promotes people to get back into working because now they're less scared about getting infected with COVID and stuff like that. But again, these are statements. Find the evidence. I haven't looked too much into this. So yeah.
Yeah, I 100% agree there. That this is a really like tough no just to take. If I was to actually draw this as an Extemp question and select it, I took a lot of econ based questions. I probably right away would have thought no, because I would want to be vaccinated at work because I feel safe, right? But when you really look at the grand scheme of things, and I guess it's a really good way to show like economic principles in action. Like this is a really good example of, if you're somebody that's really into economics and you know a lot of economic principles, lay it down here. This is like, there's a lot of good reasons as to why this is a yes. And we're trying to give that answer for that no, but even at the end of the day, we're saying if you want to go no, try to go and find that, because it's been very difficult for two people who research a lot to just find that one article that says this isn't going to happen. And I think that says quite a bit just by itself.
Mm-hmm. And like, again, if you do 3 questions and the other 2 were bad and you don't know how to answer them, maybe just try to like use a bunch of economic jargon to make it sound like you know what you're talking about, but you actually don't. I mean, do I encourage that? No. Have I done it before? Yes. And I will like excuse that kind of behavior if you're fairly new, like you just started Extemp, or like you're a novice and you have no idea what's going on, but your coach threw you in last minute. Go for it, you know? Just go with your gut and go with what makes sense to you, because that also is what makes your Extemp speech sound good to the judge and sound like you know what you're talking about, and you won't feel as nervous walking into the round, and hopefully you won't like stutter as much or feel lost as much in your speech. So yeah, go with the easiest answer for you, but also the one that you can explain the best too, if that makes sense.
I agree with that statement 100%. I don't think I can disagree there. I may or may not have also gone through the realms of I really went through and tried my best with jargon that I didn't know and got away with it. So I've
Yeah,
been
I
there.
think yeah, I think it's like a rite of passage for an extemper. All of us have gone through this at some point. But that leads us to like the last question that I really want to address, and something that you will see, maybe not in the form of like a vaccine question, but just like a form in general. But it's how should the US approach convincing Americans to get vaccinated? And I think that's a good question to talk about and kind of discuss, because it is not a yes or no answer. It is open ended. It requires you to discuss like a plan and actually formulate an opinion when you're answering this question. And it's kind of hard to answer just because there's not like a lot of articles out there that will talk about how to address this problem. They'll say this is a problem, but they won't necessarily say like, oh, here's a perfect solution and what you say in your Extemp speech, you know. So when addressing this question, you have to be sort of creative. Again, this goes back to the advice I just gave. Go with something that sounds logical to you and that you can explain fairly well. But I will say that you should answer the question by just giving some type of plan. And you shouldn't just say like, oh, this is impossible to achieve. And while it may be true, judges don't want to hear that. Judges don't want to hear a speech about how it's impossible for you to achieve when the question is phrased that way. I know one time I tried to like offer some solutions that sounded very impossible to achieve, and the judge marked me down for it because they didn't like me giving these solutions that is impossible to achieve. So I don't know, approach the question in a way that sounds achievable, but also be realistic about your answer to the question.
I want to give kind of an example of how you can go about this. I took a lot of open-ended questions like this for one particular reason, because I had a lot of freedom. Okay, when you have a question like this, you have an opportunity to propose a solution. Questions that start with how should or what should are indications of what in actual Extemp terminology is called a prescriptive speech. Now, prescriptive is kind of just like what it sounds. If you go to the doctor's office and you realize, oh, my knee hurts, the doctor is going to try to find out what's causing that, what's the effect, and they're going to provide you some kind of prescription, right? That's the idea. You're providing a solution, okay? So it's the same idea. When you develop each of your points, you start by taking the cause of what's happening, what creates an effect, and then you want to create the solution out of it, okay? I found a fantastic article that answers this question, and I'm going to kind of briefly give an answer. I don't use this answer all the way. Okay. First and foremost, with a question like this, it's good to have a thesis. Hey, your thesis is not your 3 points. There's a difference. Okay. Your thesis is an individual statement. Okay. So your 3 points should be different. There's a Los Angeles Times article. We're going to link it. And it proposes a solution of taking a sales-based approach. Okay, so first let's talk about what hasn't worked. Okay, what hasn't worked is these advertisements on TV that come on Sunday nights with people trying to push for getting the vaccine. Okay, admittedly, it's been bad for these television companies. Okay, it just hasn't really been successful. Okay? Because the sales approach that is being tried to use that's being used isn't working. So that's kind of a cause right there. Okay, we're trying to implement a sales-based approach to solving this issue through television companies like ABC. Okay, the effect of that is ABC's television ratings are going down. Okay, so we have to propose some kind of solution to solve this problem. And a solution for that would be to actually have Americans themselves who are vaccinated sell the vaccine. Okay? And here's what we mean by that. When you go into a job interview, and this is actually a good time to point this out, when you propose a solution, you're always asking who, what, where, when, why, and how. You have to answer them. Okay, there's kind of no exception. A solution has to answer those 6 questions. If you were to go into a sales or into a job for retail, right, one of the questions they may ask you is, sell me this pen. Okay, and if you turn around and you give them an answer that says, well, this pen's got a good grip, so on and so forth, that's really not going to sell the pen. Okay? By turning around and just saying that this pen's got all these great qualities isn't how you sell something. For somebody who's been selling electronics for now almost a little bit over a year, how you sell something is by creating demand, right? You start by creating demand for it by asking the person questions. Do you get sick often? Is getting sick often something that you are concerned about? And you lead them to having the demand of getting the vaccine, okay, which gives you the opportunity to propose that kind of solution, okay? And ultimately, at the end of the day, once all of those are done, you want to propose the close of the sale, right? And that's how you get somebody to get the vaccine. This should be done on an individual basis, would be the argument I propose, okay? And that's a really good way, that's just one point in a speech too, okay? That's a really good way to approach an answer to that. You state, this is what we've been doing, this is the effect of it, here's the solution and why that solution works. And when you have an open-ended question like that, you have a lot of freedom. And this LA Times article uses this idea of the individual should be selling it as a really good approach. If you've got the vaccine, sell the vaccine. Like, you're not necessarily like actually asking them for money, but like you're selling it to them as, this is the reason why you should get it. You create the demand, you create from the demand, you create the solution, and from that solution, you close the sale. And that's how you would even answer the interview question. So everybody is welcome. Okay, that's one of the most common interview questions that actually exists in retail. So life lessons and answers to Extemp questions.
Yeah. And like another thing to note is just also your 3 points doesn't necessarily have to be 3 individual solutions. They can just explore one solution, but more in depth. So for example, your first point could be about, what your solution is. And then you can talk about why it's effective. And then you could talk about why it's important that we should convince people to get vaccinated. Like, that's also an approach that you can take. I think another solution towards addressing this issue could just be to be more empathetic and like understand why there's vaccine hesitancy in the first place, because understanding is the first step to, helping you form solutions that are more effective. That's why Brennan Nyhan's study found, even though they were trying to correct misinformation, these parents that were against vaccinations were trying to correct them back and had more of an instinct to not get their child vaccinated. And so when you understand the hesitancy that people have, it's easier for you to talk to them about the hesitancy and address the problem and be like, hey, I get it. It's scary, but it's not actually that big of a deal. There's not any, side effects that are going to harm you in the future. It's not a microchip being implanted in you. Those videos of people holding magnets to their arms after their vaccines are probably fake or something like that. But just understanding people's fear can help you talk to them about it better.
And that's a really good, another really good example of like a cause effect solution style, right? We have a cause that is, we rolled out a vaccine that came pretty quick. The effect of that is that we have vaccine hesitancy, or you can go into that study that you mentioned, hey, where that is a cause that's created the effect of vaccine hesitancy, and then you go and propose that solution, right? That's how each point becomes developed in a speech like this. That's what gives these questions, that's what first off makes these questions the best ones to answer. And secondly, it's one of the reasons why when you sit there and you work to answering a question of something like this, you can be able to propose a creative solution that people want to hear. These questions are not ones that you're going to look at and say, well, let's look at the past, present, and future. Or you have your first point be all background information. If you're doing that with this kind of speech, you are pretty much guaranteed not to win that round. Okay? If you're going to use the background as a cause and transition to that effect, right? That is what makes this kind of style very difficult. But once you understand kind of how it's structured, this is one of the best styles of speeches that you can do. And oftentimes taking a question like this and using just that kind of format for each of the points, it's pretty much an automatic one in a round for Extemp. I've never had a situation in which I took a question like that and didn't end up with a 1 or a 2. That kind of question always ends up in your favor if you do it that specific way. Come up with, here's what's happened before, this is the effect that it has, and here's our solution that we are going to provide. And that's just a good tip when it comes to maybe even having that discussion, right? Because we know that this isn't just for extempers. We also want the general public to understand this. When having a conversation about your point of view here, that is a really good way to explain your point of view, is to say, this is what has happened. Here's what I think is this kind of effect and the solution that I want to provide to you.
Well, I think that concludes our second episode of the Half Hour Podcast. I hope you all have enjoyed listening to us rant about political topics and giving you advice about how to approach these topics in your daily life and also in Extemp. Please, if you have any questions, comment, or concerns, feel free to DM me or Spencer. Our socials are posted somewhere in our social media when we post about this video, or linked somewhere in the podcast description. And yeah, I hope you get the one. Let us know how you did. Let us know how we're doing. And thank you so much.
And thank you all so much. Thank you for tuning in for a longer episode too. We hope that this provides a lot of good information. This is definitely not supposed to be used for a prep speech or prep time, but this has a lot of good information and really good discussion about what's going on. As always, if you have any questions, concerns, you can hit us up on the DMs and Instagram. Thank you all so much for your undivided attention. And from the Half Hour Podcast, we will see you all later.